cold, cloudy night over British Columbia in 1950, the crew of a massive B-36 bomber are forced to bail out over forbidding terrain after 3 of the 6 engines catch fire. Several of the men are lost, but the aircraft itself is found years later, over 300 kilometers away, a discovery that has left an enduring mystery. In early 1950, the B-36 Peacemaker is the shiny new toy in the arsenal of the U.S. Strategic Air Command, having achieved initial operational capability only 2 years prior. At this point, the aircraft is still undergoing extended development and operational testing, and it won't be until 2 years later in 1952 that the B-36 is considered fully operational. In February 1950, the 436th Bombardment Squadron of the 7th Bomb Wing, stationed at Carswell Air Force Base, Texas, deploys 2 B-36B models, the first nuclear-capable version of the aircraft, to Eielson Air Force Base, Alaska, as part of an exercise designed to test the ability of men and machine to operate in the locations and extreme weather conditions they will likely face if directed to stage for an attack on the Soviet Union. The aircraft are each carrying a Mark IV nuclear bomb, a 10,000-pound device with 37 kilotons of explosive power that has been fielded only within the past year. One of the safety and security features of the Mark IV design is its removable core, which is intended to be kept separate from the weapon in all situations short of war. The plan is for multiple aircraft to conduct a 24-hour flight in which they will take off from Eielson, proceed south along the coast of Canada, turn east over Washington State, fly to Montana, then turn west once again to conduct a simulated attack on San Francisco. After the attack run, the aircraft will return to their home station at Carswell Air Force Base, Texas. At 0027 Zulu on February 13, 1950, Bomber 075 departs Eielson Air Force Base, followed shortly by its wingman, Tail 083. 075 has a crew of 17 men, including 2 pilots, 2 flight engineers, a navigator, radar operator, bombardier, 8 enlisted men operating as gunners, observers, and a radio mechanic, and a weaponeer and bomb commander who are responsible for the nuclear weapon on board. 7 hours into the flight, approaching midnight local time as the aircraft passes east of Sandspit, British Columbia, the aircraft encounters heavy icing. As aircraft commander Captain Barry climbs to 15,000 feet to escape the icing, the crew notices a fire in one engine, followed by another, and then another. The combined effects of heavy icing, the weight of a nearly full load of fuel, and the loss of half the aircraft's engines causes the aircraft to begin descending. At 0740 Zulu, while flying southbound just west of Princess Royal Island, Captain Barry issues a final distress call stating that he intends to bail out. Before bailing out, however, the crew jettisoned the Mark IV nuclear bomb over the water and observed the detonation of its high explosives. This task complete, Barry maneuvers the aircraft back over land to provide the best chance of survival for him and his crew. Just past midnight local time on the morning of 14 February, Barry directs the crew to bail out into the dark, frigid night amid driving rain and the winds of over 50 miles per hour. Before exiting the aircraft himself, Barry sets the autopilot to a heading of 165 degrees true so that the aircraft will presumably crash at sea. The men rapidly exit the aircraft and all land within a distance of less than 2 miles of one another. After bailing out, Captain Barry looks into the sky to track his aircraft. Despite this being night, Barry is able to follow the aircraft by the light of its burning engines, and he observes the aircraft turn around and fly back overhead, now on a northerly heading. A search effort involving dozens of aircraft from the U.S. and Canadian militaries and Coast Guards is quickly organized but hampered by inclement weather conditions and the dense foliage of the region. Nevertheless, over the ensuing days, 12 of the men are found and rescued. Considerable efforts are expended during the ensuing weeks to find the remaining 5 men, but without success. Based on the order of bailout and locations of the survivors, it seems likely that the missing men, most of whom were the first out of the aircraft, had landed in the 2 to 4 mile wide channel to the northwest of Princess Royal Island. After thousands of man-hours of searching, the fate of the missing men seems clear and the search is called off. Questions remain about the fate of the bomber, but there is simply nothing to be done about it and the trail goes cold. Over 3 years later, in September 1953, the Royal Canadian Air Force is conducting another search effort to find American oil millionaire Ellis Hall when they discover bomber 075 largely intact on the side of Mount Colleget, nearly 350 kilometers away from the coastal area where the survivors have been found. The U.S. Air Force is notified and soon dispatches aircraft to reconnoiter the site. The helicopters available at the time are not up to the task of delivering a suitably equipped team directly to the site, so an expedition must be launched by land. Despite 3 separate efforts in 1953, none of the Air Force teams managed to reach the wreckage due to the challenging terrain and weather conditions. Finally, in August 1954, the 4th Air Force expedition manages to reach the crash site and proceeds to destroy the sensitive parts of the aircraft. The proximate cause of the accident is straightforward. The engine fires were the result of ice buildup in the engine carburetors, which interfered with the system that metered the amount of fuel delivered to the engine. As a result, excessive fuel was dumped into the engines, which caught fire. This was an expensive and painful lesson. Arguably, it could have been avoided, as a similar carburetor malfunction had occurred to another B-36 a month prior to the February disaster, though that aircraft managed to land safely. The more mysterious elements of the Bomber 075 story concern whether the aircraft was carrying nuclear materials, the fate of the missing crew members, and, in particular, whether someone stayed on board to pilot the aircraft to its final crash site. There is no debate that Bomber 075 was indeed carrying a Mark IV bomb, and multiple crew members have stated that they observed the bomb detonate after it was dropped as the crew prepared to abandon the aircraft. The airburst detonation of the 5,000 pounds of high explosives on the bomb would have completely destroyed the device, but there would have been no risk of a nuclear explosion since the core was not installed on the bomb. The main question is thus whether Bomber 075 carried a live nuclear core separately, which might have remained with the aircraft when it finally crashed. The theory goes that part of Bomber 075's mission might have been for the weaponeer to practice the first in-flight insertion procedure in which the core was installed in the bomb body, resulting in a live nuclear weapon. In support of the idea that the aircraft may have been carrying a live nuclear core, co-pilot Whitfield said in a 1998 interview that the crew believed that they were carrying the real thing, i.e. a fully functional nuclear weapon. However, such assertions contradict declassified Air Force documents which state that Bomber 075 was equipped with only a dummy weapon core. While there is the possibility that the Air Force was lying, this seems unlikely for 3 reasons. First, the declassified documents discussing the aircraft's payload were never intended for public relief, so it seems unlikely that they would contain information that was known to be false. Second, the assertion that the aircraft was not carrying a nuclear core is consistent with the documented timeline of nuclear weapons custody between the Atomic Energy Commission and the military. Weapons were tightly controlled by the AEC, and it was not until April 1951, over a year after the Bomber 075 accident, that President Truman first authorized the AEC to release a handful of nuclear cores to military custody as part of a contingency plan for the Korean War. Finally, examination of the crash wreckage indicates that a nuclear core was not on board. The specially designed device known as a bird cage that would have carried the nuclear core was found at the crash site and salvaged by a civilian. Had the bird cage contained a nuclear core, it seems overwhelmingly probable that the Air Force mission to the site in 1954 would have removed it along with the core itself. Moreover, subsequent radiation scans of the site conducted by Canadian government missions in the 1990s did not find any significant radiation, making it unlikely that a core was ever present in the wreckage. Sadly, it seems very likely that the first 4 men to exit the aircraft succumbed to hypothermia or drowning. Based on the locations where the survivors landed and the known trajectory of the aircraft, it seems clear that most of the missing men landed in the water. Not wearing proper survival gear for the conditions, they would have perished quickly. This conclusion was supported when searchers discovered 1, some sources report 2, life rafts in the channel north of Princess Royal Island. The raft was intact and none of its survival supplies had been opened, suggesting that the owner had quickly perished. A gruesome discovery in 1952 gave further testament to this outcome when a fisherman discovered a parachute entangled with a human foot near Ashdown Island. As one of the missing men, and given his unique status as the specially trained weaponeer responsible for the Mark IV, Captain Ted Schreier is sometimes portrayed in the Bomber 075 story with an aura of mystery, with the suggestion that he may have stayed on board to fly the aircraft to its final crash site. This idea is due in part to an account of the bailout given in 1998 by co-pilot Ray Whitfield, who stated that Schreier was the last man on board the aircraft, and that no one knew for sure if he actually bailed out. Additionally, at least 2 sources claim that a body was found in the aircraft wreckage by the 1954 expedition. However, the official reports generated at the time of the expedition do not indicate that any remains were found, and the individuals who assert that human remains were found at the crash site were themselves only peripheral players and not directly involved in the expedition. With regard to Schreier being the last man on board after the bailout, it seems clear that he was not among the first 4 men who bailed out and almost certainly drowned in the channel. In fact, Schreier was one of the last 3 men on board the aircraft, although the testimony of the pilot and co-pilot differ as to whether Schreier was the last or the second to last man out of the aircraft. According to co-pilot Whitfield, Schreier had mistakenly donned his life preserver on top of his parachute harness rather than beneath it, and had to take time to correct his gear before leaving the aircraft. If Schreier had indeed exited after Whitfield, he should have landed on Princess Royal Island and been found. If he instead remained on the aircraft to correct his gear, then the aircraft may have been over the water again when he finally jumped, meaning that his fate was the same as that of the other missing men. The biggest mystery of the Bomber 075 story is how the aircraft landed, largely intact, almost 350 kilometers from the location where the crew bailed out. Now, it's important to note that there have been multiple instances in which aircraft have continued to fly for extended distances after the crew bailed out. And the B-36 did have an autopilot, so the fact that the aircraft traveled a significant distance is not by itself too mysterious. However, the situation does seem baffling for 2 reasons. First, the crew bailed out because the aircraft was weighed down with icing, had 3 engines on fire, and was unable to maintain altitude. Second, Captain Barry reportedly set the autopilot to a heading of 165 degrees with the expectation that the aircraft would crash at sea. Instead of continuing south towards the ocean, the aircraft turned to a nearly reciprocal heading to the north. The simplest explanation to the first point is that jettisoning the 5-ton weapon and another 1 to 2 tons of men and gear was enough to arrest the aircraft's gradual descent. While 12,000 pounds would represent only a 3 to 4% change in the aircraft's total weight, the aircraft was descending only gradually, and this relatively small reduction in weight, in conjunction with the warmer air at lower altitude, which would cause the airframe icing to sublimate, likely enabled the aircraft to continue flying and even climb. With regard to the 180-degree change in direction of travel, there are 2 possibilities. First, in the hectic conditions immediately prior to bailing out of the aircraft, Barry may have simply made a mistake and set the autopilot heading to the reciprocal of the course he was flying. The second and more intriguing possibility is that Schreier remained on board the aircraft to continue flying it after he delayed his bailout to remove his life vest and don it beneath his parachute. Although Schreier was not a B-36 pilot, he may have been sufficiently comfortable with the controls to set the autopilot to a northerly heading to enable him to bail out over land. If this was the case, Schreier may have left the aircraft a few minutes after his crewmates, only to drown in one of the numerous channels and inlets to the north of Princess Royal Island. With regard to the theory that Schreier may have remained on board throughout the entire flight, there are significant problems with this theory. Why would Schreier do this? What reason would he have to believe that he could save the aircraft when 2 qualified pilots and flight engineers had failed to do so? Where was Schreier going, and why didn't he attempt to contact their wingman, Tail 83, via radio? There are some theories that attempt to address these objections, but on balance, it seems most likely that Schreier either bailed out with the rest of the crew or stayed on board the aircraft only long enough to set the autopilot on a northerly heading. First, in terms of the nuclear device, the safety system functioned as intended by keeping the nuclear core separate from the main bomb body unless preparing for a live weapon drop. The system enabled the crew of 075 to safely jettison and destroy the Mark IV, preventing it from falling into enemy hands and avoiding any risk of a nuclear explosion. Lessons were also learned in terms of search and rescue. The crew's parachutes were entirely white, making them difficult to spot from the air against a snowy background. Situations such as this are why many modern parachutes incorporate colored panels that can be used as signal markers. Another lesson is the principle dress to egress, that is, that air crews should wear clothing suitable for the worst terrain over which they could be forced down. A key factor in the loss of the 5 crew members is that apparently none of the crew had donned their waterproof exposure suits. Though the standard operating procedure was apparently for exposure suits to be worn when over water, these were uncomfortable and the crew chose not to wear them. Unfortunately, by the time the severity of the situation became clear, the crew apparently didn't believe they had the time or opportunity to put on their exposure suits. Instead, they were wearing the heavy insulated suits that would keep them warm in dry conditions, but which would become ineffective in wet conditions and a real liability if landing in the water. Finally, the Bomber 075 accident shows the inherent risks associated with operating technically immature aircraft in challenging environments. SAC leaders likely knew that there would be difficulties associated with operations in the far north, and the exercise was probably intended in part to poke the bear and give crews first-hand experience in dealing with those challenges in a peacetime environment. A more deliberate approach to testing B-36 capabilities in Arctic conditions would have involved extended duration flights in challenging weather conditions, but without nuclear devices on board and while remaining closer to a location suitable for an emergency landing. However, set against the backdrop of Cold War tensions, the risks of accidents like that of Bomber 075 were evidently considered more acceptable than the risk that SAC forces would be caught unprepared due to an excessively slow testing process. In other words, while the loss of the 5 men was a tragedy, set against the tens of thousands of airmen lost in the skies over Europe and the Pacific at the height of World War II, less than a decade prior to the accident, accidents like that of Bomber 075 were considered an acceptable cost to rapidly establish a credible nuclear deterrent against another such conflict. A couple of notes on research and production. First, thanks to Flight Sim Historical Society for the great simulator footage. Second, multiple books have been written about the Bomber 075 accident, and I'll list my recommendations in the description. In any case, there are many ideas about what happened after most of the crew bailed out and what the Air Force found at the crash site. I've tried to sort through the less credible theories and present what seems to be the most likely sequence of events, but let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below. This has been Aviation Horrors. Thanks for listening.